I also want to address a little bit about proportions. Proportions is something that we see so often in the real world, and it's something that is a little bit abstract for students because we're having to actually work from one ratio into another ratio. So one of the really important things with proportions is when we introduce them to students, it will be helpful if we can start out with a real world application and don't even mention the word proportion. We just start talking about what their thought process is, how are they going to figure out the problem, and then we can start looking at transferring that into a proportion and into ratios, and we can really get into the language after that. So the first thing I would say is, well, if we can walk 4 miles in 1 hour, how many miles can we walk in 2 hours? And this student would probably realize that if it takes us 1 hour to walk 4 miles, I can walk another 4 miles in another hour, which means I could walk a total of 8 miles. And they would have the correct reasoning, the correct thought process without having even mentioned the word proportion or ratio or any of those math terminology words, just simply through their reasoning. And then from that, I can talk about how now we look at these as two ratios. I can walk 4 miles in 1 hour. So 4 miles per 1 hour would equal how many miles? I don't know. So because I have miles in the numerator here, I also need to have miles in the numerator here. So I don't know how many miles I can walk, so I'm just going to put a question mark there. So I'm going to walk, I don't know how many miles, in 2 hours. So now the students can see that we really have two ratios that are set equal to each other. This would be a really good time to point out that we have miles in the numerator here, so we also need to have miles in the numerator here. We have hours in the denominator. We also need to have hours in the denominator. One thing that is really important is that ratios do not have to have, proportions do not have to have the same unit throughout the entire proportion. Only the numerators need to match. Only the denominators need to match. There is no way I can turn miles into hours or hours into miles. But my numerators are lined up and my denominators are lined up for units. So at this point, now we can talk with the student about what did they do to figure out the problem. Well, they knew that I doubled the time. I went from 1 hour to 2 hours. So I had to actually multiply by 2 to get from here to here. So that will have to be the same in the numerator to stay within proportion. If I multiply the denominator by 2, I also need to multiply the numerator by 2, which leaves me with a total of 8 miles. So the student would know they could walk 8 miles in 2 hours. Going through another example, just so we can see this again. A student can color 10 pages in 2 hours. How long will it take them to color 30 pages? This one might be a little bit trickier for a student to figure out right away. So maybe this would be a good place to show them that setting up a proportion might be helpful to guide our thought process. So I would say that I can color 10 pages in 2 hours. How long will it take? Well, that's how many hours to color 30 pages. So the other part of this that I know is how many pages I can color. So the number of pages, because I have pages in the numerator here, I also have to have pages in my numerator here. So here is where I'm going to write 30 pages. And this time, my question mark is how many hours. So that's actually going to go in the denominator. So this is where setting up a proportion can maybe be helpful in organizing their thoughts. Am I going to multiply the 30, the 2, the 10? I'm not really sure. So when we set up the proportion, they can start to organize those thoughts. So now what they can do is when they look at this proportion, they can say, well, I can see that to get from 10 to 30, I have to multiply by 3. So to get from 2 to my question mark, I'm also going to have to multiply by 3, which 2 hours times 3 is going to give me 6 hours. So as you can see in proportions, we are looking at a relationship with multiplication and not addition or subtraction. We are multiplying as we move across, and we are not adding as we move across.